when he talked about the dialects being more a matter of, they're just varieties of a language, and to linguists, and I'm a linguist too, they're scientifically equally adequate one to another. One is not better or worse, but they are socially evaluated as better or worse because they're connected with particular speakers. So people make fun of what you can hear on the West Side sometimes in English, because that's Appalachian. It's connected with country and people coming from the mountains in Kentucky and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where all this comes from. Why do we have these attitudes about dialects? Because people didn't always, in the history of, even in the history of English, there wasn't always a quote-unquote standard English. But I wanted to point out first, why focus on language at all? This is one of my favorite points to make when I'm teaching, but when you think about it, even if you're not a language arts teacher or a Spanish teacher or something, language is still absolutely central to what you do, because all education is conducted through language. So it's like the medium, and sometimes it's the content that we're explicitly teaching when we're teaching composition, when we're teaching reading comprehension, when we're teaching other languages than English. Another interesting thing that people are not always consciously aware of, but language policy made by governments is very often carried out through education, through mass education. This happened in the Mexican Revolution, where they did, and it's happened in a number of literacy campaigns in Cuba, Nicaragua, Tanzania, in Africa, where they decide, okay, everybody's going to be literate, and they send the students out to the countryside, and suddenly, then they get a 98% literacy rate. In the Mexican Revolution, they decided to promote revolutionary thinking and ideas, and what is the threesome there? It's not the same as in French, but libertad, liberty, equality. Fraternity, thank you. Well, that's French, but yeah. At any rate, promote all of those ideals through education by developing schools where there never were schools before. So the revolution was like 1910, 1920, and in the rancho where I've been a lot, formed part of my study, they didn't have a teacher into the 40s, till the 1940s, and that was a teacher who came to the rancho, and she taught classes in her house, and she had to charge a few centavos per week to the kids, and even then some of the kids couldn't afford to have schooling, so they didn't really get public schooling until the 1950s. Okay, so I want to step back for a minute, since we end up as educators, we end up carrying out language policy, but we sometimes aren't aware of the fact that we're doing this. Let's talk about, there's a whole field now that's developed recently about language policy and what it is, and it's kind of interesting. There's really two kinds, according to a lot of researchers. One is the official language policy. Like one time I wanted to see, what does the Chicago Board of Ed actually say, because I do a lot of research in Chicago, about language variation, about bilingualism. And so I searched their documents on the web until I found their statement, and it was absolutely logically nonsensical. And I decided not to go in that direction today, but I mean, it basically said your second language should help you stay identified with your community. I'm thinking, second? That's people's first language. English is their second language. There was a lot of confusion, and there was no mention at all of dialects, of vernacular dialects. The Spanish that a lot of the Mexicans bring to Chicago is this rural dialect, the ranchero dialect that you may have read about in my chapter, that Terrell was mentioning, ancina instead of así, and a lot of different verb forms and pronunciations. Anyway, you can look for language policy then, what laws say, what are the official stances governments have, or you can look at the unofficial, sort of the conventional, what people call conventional wisdom, unofficial beliefs about language that people have. And this guy Schiffman wrote a book called Linguistic Culture, in which he talked about the fact that the second type is much more important because it's everybody's attitudes, it's everybody's beliefs, you know, about the fact that, say, inner city speakers who are African American speak a dialect that linguists call African American vernacular English. And you interview a guy on the street and they'll say, oh, yes, that's so incorrect. I mean, Maya Angelou will say it's incorrect, you know. Bill Cosby will say it's incorrect. So there's this widespread belief that vernacular dialects are inadequate, they're incorrect, etc., even though linguists have shown the systematic nature and how patterned they are and how complex they are. I can put this up on Carmen, this PowerPoint, so you don't have to write anything down, but what Schiffman then called linguistic culture is what we think about language, and it's in our everyday thinking, and we don't question it unless we stop to think about it. It varies across cultures and historical periods, but is absolutely important in education because teachers who become aware of the fact that dialects are really not inadequate have a different attitude toward them and then toward the speakers of those dialects. And we all know about the effect of expectations on student achievement. Another word for linguistic culture is what some people are calling language ideologies. If you've taken any courses on this, you might have heard that term. And what people mean, this is an official definition in the field, it's really belief systems about language that are widely shared, but they go beyond language. They end up being representations of groups of language users. So you get, it moves into ideas of citizenship, good and bad people, quality, value, and that sort of thing. So it spreads beyond just the beliefs about the language itself. And usually what it results in is some kind of social hierarchy. So that some people, if they speak, quote unquote, better than others, they are better people, you know, better citizens.
But they get the better jobs.
And they get the better jobs.
And so should not, as educators, should we not be teaching them that, okay, you speak and talk like this, you know, in your day-to-day conversation, that if you're planning on moving up and getting higher education, then you also need to learn this other way of speaking.
I agree with you 100%. You'll get a different answer from different researchers, but I taught composition for many years. And yes, I agree. But I think what's really crucial is the attitude we have toward the other way people speak. You know, it's one thing to say, you know, think of it this way, a Spanish speaker they say, well, Spanish, oh, that's a language. So moving to English, you have then two languages. But if you speak a non-standard or vernacular dialect of English, it doesn't get treated with the same respect. Yeah.
So it seems to me, in other words, you know, a language or a dialect is correct or incorrect based on its social context.
Appropriate, I would say.
Absolutely right or wrong. It's just for the academic context, you need to follow these rules. But, you know, if I'm hanging out in the hood, you know, talking with guys on the street, well, if I use academic, you know,
you would be laughed at.
Well, I'm going to be incorrect there. You know?
Yeah, right.
You know, so it's relative to the context.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't agree. I mean, some people in my field have different opinions, but I still think if we're educators and we're teaching writing and reading, we should teach the academic language because it will open doors for people. Yeah.
Something also brought to my attention. I was talking with the principal this year, and she was sharing, I forget the title of the book, but some evidence that teenagers don't want people outside of their peer group talking to them the way they talk.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That would make sense. Yeah. Teachers are supposed to talk in a certain way. Right. And some kids, I had a student do a project where she interviewed some Somali adolescents, And they kept talking about, she was talking about hip-hop language. She wanted to find out about what they created hip-hop verses and put them online and so forth. And they were absolutely adamant that those should not be in school, because that was not appropriate for school. That was street talk, and we fool around with that with our friends, but that's not appropriate for school. Yeah, so a lot of kids will say that too.
Are we talking register? What I think is register, everybody knows how to handle different registers within their speech.
Some people talk about it in terms of register. Register means what's appropriate to the context.
Yeah.
So, but other people talk about it in terms of dialects, depending on, you know. But the whole idea is that you should have more than one. It should be what they call additive education rather than subtractive education. Respect for what the kids already know, but build on that so they can have more registers, yeah, in their repertoire. And I think academic English actually is best described as a register, because there's a lot of variation within it when you think about it. Across the disciplines, there's very different ways of reading and writing, and organization of text and so forth. There's different genres. So, yeah, register would be. I have to say too, though, well, maybe I'll get to this, but, or maybe it was in my chapter that you read, actually, that I have had kids in my study be denigrated both by their Spanish teachers and their English teachers for the way they speak in Chicago, because their Spanish is ranchero Spanish. It's rural, it's disrespected in Mexico by educated people, and the Spanish teacher here or in Chicago was from Argentina, and he was just appalled at the Spanish of this kid, and he said, "Oh my God, we're going to clean up your Spanish." So this kid said to me, "I guess I don't speak either English or Spanish very well." You know, I mean, it's really sad. So we might, like a lot of things, this is a historical creation, this set of attitudes. We think of them as natural because we're brought up with them. I mean, I was brought up by my mother correcting my English so I didn't sound like I was south of Broad Street. Right? You know, because that was more Appalachian. You know, don't say it that way. You know, so you begin to think it's natural, you know, but it actually isn't. There is an ideology of what we call language standardization. There's an ideology of monolingualism, believe it or not, in this day and age with globalization, but there's sort of an unconscious set of beliefs among people in the US for sure, and other places in the world, that English only, like this goes on in Australia too, for example, that we only need one language, and even though there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, that even Alzheimer's is delayed if you're bilingual. So, you know, it's like we should all be learning as many languages as we can. They've shown more cognitive flexibility with bilinguals. I mean, there's all kinds of wonderful advantages. But I have had to learn that research doesn't make the day, you know, that even if there's evidence, that's not how you change people's opinions. So I wanted to find out, well, where did this come from? Why do we have these attitudes? These two particular attitudes, actually, they're discussed separately, but historically they emerged together in Europe with modernization and the rise of European nation states in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's really interesting. There's a couple of books that talk about, one is called Authority in English by Milroy and Milroy, that gives you a couple chapters on the history of standard English. Where did it come from? It didn't used to exist, this notion that there's a standard correct way to speak. It started with printing in England in the 15th century, and that led to increased uniformity in the written English. What happened was you'd have a printer in different regions of England, and they would print, they'd have to decide how to spell things. And there was so much regional dialect variation that they would just spell it the way their particular dialect would pronounce it. And eventually a guy named Caxton won out, and the dialect he was writing down won out. It was the dialect around London, which was associated with more powerful people.
The Queen.
Received pronunciation, yes. Which means received by the Queen or the King. And then written English became this model or a standard, even though the oral language, if you've ever gone to England, there's still intense variation. It's a very small place, but you go a few hours and you hear very different pronunciations. So the pressures for standardizing, having a standard language, didn't really start until the 1700s, according to the Milroys, when English was finally established over French as the national language. So even then, they had a bilingual state, really, French and English, ever since the Normans took over in 1066. There were advances in the 18th century in technology. That's when industrialization was really gaining steam. Literacy, communication, more widespread education. And then this idea developed that there was a right way to speak and write English. It was correct. There are all kinds of manuals published then on how to pronounce English correctly, how certain features of English were incorrect, and these were eagerly bought by the rising middle class to sort of help them in their upward social mobility. Meanwhile, all the languages that had already been there before in dialects didn't fare so well. Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, the latter two having Gaelic and the former having Welsh, that kind of was treated with a lot less respect, and people switched over to English. So this is a good example, Britain, a good example of monolingualism in the sense of one language, one nation becoming the norm, whereas it wasn't before then. Yeah.
I have a question about language change, or
yeah.
I've always thought, or maybe was told, that like in the United States, part of the reason with the media, you were talking about the printing, how we've grown to get like a standardized English because of media influences and everybody sees the same type of thing. You were just saying that in England, you can still go 5 hours north and it'll sound very, very different.
Yeah.
I don't think that's as true here in the U.S. anymore. Would you
Oh,
guys argue the same or the different?
There's enormous variation. There's a wonderful old film called American Tongues, yeah, where you hear incredible variation. I mean, I heard it driving around. I couldn't find I couldn't find this library the first day. I thought, where is it? There was a guy out walking his dog. I rolled my window down and I said, can you tell me, is there a library near here? And he answered me and told me where it was, and I thought, oh, like Terrell said, my ears got real big. I was listening, wow, that's different. That's different from what I hear in Grandview or Upper Arlington or, other places in Columbus. So it's still really alive and well. And in Ohio, you might know, we have 3 dialect bands. So the northern, you go to Cleveland and it sounds like they do in Chicago or Detroit. That's the northern city's vowel shift. And the central Ohio here is in between North Midland, but Cincinnati is southern, right? So it's really very different even in Ohio. So I don't think the oral language has standardized very much, although you tend to get more similarities the higher education, but that's probably the effect of education. So educated people across regions will sound more similar, but it depends on context, right? Even our own language changes from context to context.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other good example of this one language, one nation idea is France, where, and it's really interesting. You think of the French Revolution as the good guys, right? Well, they were, in many ways. The revolutionaries wanting equality, fraternity, liberty, but they promoted something even more that had started before them, but they promoted this idea of standard French. Francisation, you know, you have to make everybody speak the standard French. And if any of you have traveled in France, probably a bunch of you have, you can really hear differences. I was recently at a family wedding reception, and we were in Southwest France, and we were sitting, this is what linguists do, you know, you're sitting at a table and there's somebody over there, and I kept hearing this really different kind of French, and I was like practically like this, you know, trying to pick it up without being obvious, because it was fascinating. And one of the things I heard sounded like Spanish. So it's really, and it was, I found out later, they say in Spanish, todas las personas, all the people. In toutes les personnes in French, standard French, but in this region it was todas las personas. And I thought, well, that's more Spanish than French, because it was on the way to France. I mean, on the way to Spain, if you know what I mean. And if you travel south toward Italy, it starts sounding more Italian. I mean, so there's incredible variation, although the little patois are dying out. These were older people sitting at the next table. So, but they referred, in France they have both other languages, like in Britain, and also dialects of French. For example, Basque in southwest France is not even related to, it's a different language. It's not even, it's not a Romance language. And there are other languages like that have been squished in favor of the standard French, which was the dialect from Paris, right? Because that's where the power was. And both the monarchy and the church, before the revolution, had promoted the local languages and dialects, probably divide and conquer mentality, you know? Let them not communicate with each other to do an uprising against us. And the church, because of wanting to make converts in people's native languages. So that doubly reinforced the revolutionaries wanting to force standard French, one language for everybody. And then they decided to carry this out through education. So the patois were said to be barriers to communication, obstacles to the revolution. People would never be freed until they all learned standard French. And I think they're still guided by this policy today in the school system. So these two ideologies came together, standardization and monolingualism, in both England and France. I haven't looked at other countries, but this, or even if this has happened elsewhere outside of Europe, it might have, but in particular, these European ideologies ended up traveling around the world with European colonization. So you get this attitude a lot of places in the world now. In fact, most places have had to, post-colonial countries have had to figure out what's their language going to be, their official language. India, for example, I think has English and Hindi both as national languages because they had been converted over to English already, and all the government was in English, and they decided that would be more practical, but they wanted some sense of national identity, so they put Hindi in there too. And so that's a case where they decided in two, but other places have decided we all have to have the same language, just like England and France did. One woman wrote, this is a woman who studied Gaelic in Scotland and how it was dying out, Nancy Dorian, and she was talking about how, in another article, an ideology of contempt, and I really like that phrase because I think it's not just the ideology of standardization, but an ideology of contempt toward non-standard languages and small languages worldwide. And that this, she says, this has really contributed to language death all over the world because of this set of ideologies and attitudes. So you get people on the street saying, they gotta speak English. We should all speak English. How are we gonna communicate with each other if, you know, and this becomes English only rather than English plus. I mean, it doesn't mean you shouldn't keep just being able to communicate, all of us, in English doesn't mean we couldn't have other languages, but that gets sort of erased. Some people believe bilingualism is sort of a heavy burden. I mean, gee, won't the children be confused? I don't know, you may have heard this from some of your parents. When in fact, we're now finding through research all these wonderful advantages to bilingualism. But this explains the furor not only over all these ideologies and this history, not only over the English-only panic, I would call it, but over the Ebonics controversy in the 1996. If you remember, you guys aren't too young for that, I hope. But it was a major, major crisis. And this is when the Oakland School Board said, we've got all these children in Oakland schools who are not learning to read and write in standard English. This is a real problem because they don't speak it, they don't speak that dialect at home. So we need to recognize their language, and they named it Ebonics. Unfortunately, I didn't consult with African American linguists who are right there at Stanford and Berkeley. However, you know, they decided to go ahead with this, and their intention was good. It was not saying we need to teach Ebonics. I mean, the kids already know it. Why would you teach it, right? It was saying let's recognize it, let's respect it as a language, and then teach them through maybe contrastive analysis or something, because they're failing, you know? To these huge percentages are failing, we've got to do something. Yeah.
Well, it's like last year was, I've been teaching for 10 years, and every year I taught Spanish. Last year, I used another degree that I have, and I started teaching Spanish and social studies. It's the first year I've ever taught social studies. It was American history, and you know, there's a big push for writing and whatnot, so I'd give them essay questions on the test. And I don't know if it's because I've been out of the loop or what, because I've been teaching Spanish, but the essays would come back and it would look like a text message.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same, what you're talking here.
Yeah.
They're so used to this that they can't equate.
I've heard that from other composition teachers too, yeah, that this is creeping into, you know, and it would be a register difference there, you know, that you have to teach them, that's okay for texts, but in academic language, you need to be more explicit. You need to not be so elliptical, you know. But at any rate, this controversy, all kinds of African American leaders like Bill Cosby and Jesse Jackson.
I remember we got on the news like every day. It was like,
oh, it was huge. It was a huge thing. And Maya Angelou, and they were saying, what are you talking about? This is ghettos talk. I mean, they were really had as much of this ideology as anybody. Jesse Jackson finally sat down with a bunch of linguists that I mentioned before at Stanford and Berkeley, and for 3 days, and they talked to him about the research. He came out of that and made a public statement and said, okay, I get what you're saying now. He said, but you're not getting your message out. You guys got to get your message out better. Well, linguists have been trying to get this message out for decades. There's this kind of sociolinguistic research has been going on since the 60s. And it's, I think why the message isn't getting out is we have these really deeply rooted ideologies that come from those European nation states that we have to all speak the same language and it has to be the standard language. I think we're running into a brick wall, and it may be cracking a little bit now because of globalization, but it's been very, very hard to convince anybody of the linguistic research, you know. This guy is really interesting. He wrote this article about the culture of what he calls monoglot standard. This is where these two ideologies come together. He said, this is a paradox. You look around the US, anywhere, lettuce farms, subways, you're hearing other languages all over the place, you know. And now we hear them in Columbus, you know, whereas you didn't used to. But there's this persistent belief, nevertheless. We gotta be monolingual, we gotta be, you know, English only, whatever. And this kind of ideology, he said, it makes it seem natural to connect certain languages with certain cultural groups. And then they get described as being sloppy or uneducated or imprecise. I mean, they may in fact be uneducated, but imprecise, inaccurate, sloppy in their language. They're really not any of those things. They're just speaking a vernacular dialect that they learned in their homes and communities. So when you think about what is standard English, I mean, I should ask you guys, you're all teachers. It isn't something I think that is actually real. I think it's a concept we have. You know, who do the standard English speakers, that people you think of as standard English speakers, do they all sound the same? Really? Do you think, I mean, our language system is up here on the left side of the brain. Do you think we all have the same sets of rules, you know, to produce? Actually, we don't, because if you just listen to each of us, you hear differences. But most of those differences among educated people don't get noticed. They don't matter. Why is it the unconjugated B that you hear in rap songs and stuff? He be walking to school, you know, or whatever. That everybody notices, all right? That becomes salient. That gets stigmatized because of who it represents, right? As Terrell said, you can drop R's and people will criticize you, but wait a minute, British people drop R's. You know, we think that's upper class, you know? In some Brits, I mean, I've overheard by accident them talking about American speakers. They really look down on all of us, you know, many of them. So it's all a social thing. Now I think, and I said this a long time ago, but what's really considered standard is just the absence of any of those stigmatized features. If you don't do double negatives, if you don't say ain't, if you don't use unconjugated be, if you use a th instead of a t, d for like dis and dat, you know, then you're sort of received as a standard speaker. So it's really what it doesn't have rather than what it has.
So you notice for not making mistakes.
Yeah, what we consider mistakes. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe part of the problem is, I was thinking like the issue of, you know, how come people aren't learning this better from the linguists and stuff, is I think it's one of these issues where it's a problem with, we all think we know too much about language.
Because we all speak
It's like,
it, yeah.
It reminds me of people criticizing teachers in education. They've all been to school, so they all
Right.
understand, you know, how school works and should work. And with English, you know, we all grew up learning it, and, you know, my teachers in elementary school, there were these rules and stuff. It's all very standardized, right? Because, you know,
Yeah.
so we all think we know everything there is really to know about English and how it's standardized. You know, we don't study the history of language or racial
Yeah.
variation. We don't study those things. But since we've had so much experience with it, we think we understand it anyway.
I think
And
that's
so
right.
we don't need to listen to the linguists. We already understand, you know, how these things work. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Something keeps changing hands.
Yeah.
One of my friends is a reporter for a news station, and she said they're trained, you know, to
Yeah.
speak the way they speak on the news. They're trained
Yeah.
to speak that way. It's kind of like acting. And then I notice sometimes when you watch CNN or MSNBC, you'll listen to a broadcaster and they'll slip. Like
Yes.
you'll hear a slip. And sometimes they'll even joke about, oops, went back to New Jersey, or oops, you'll hear them like fall out of it, and then they'll
Yeah.
go right back into it.
Yeah.
So they get trained in like the standard Midwestern kind
Yeah.
of.
And that, interestingly enough, was a specific decision made by a group of people who met as a committee and decided that Midwestern should be, you know, so-called standard English Midwestern should be the dialect.
Was it in your class, maybe in your class, and I'm repeating what she said, or maybe it was in the sociolinguistics class, that
Yeah.
they chose the Midwest because it was least associated with other countries, like in the East Coast will be London, the West Coast will be,
Oh.
you know, the features of these other countries. And they decided that more, after the Appalachians, it was like what it will become the United States. It was not really affiliated to directly to another country, and that's why they chose the Midwest. It's not because the Midwest
Had more power.
Had more power. Exactly, they have,
Yes.
you know, more farms and stuff, and it was
Yeah.
because, it will develop the United States. It will not be a reminiscence,
Yeah.
thank you, of the other countries. But it had
Yeah.
nothing to do with, Farr in the Midwest.
So many of these things are just, something happened in history and people decided and that's the way it went. It's not, you know.
Ya ha sido estándar, ¿no? La Academia Real de la Lengua. We know that they have
Yeah.
a full control
Yeah.
of the language, the Spanish language, you know, and France too. They have
Yeah.
specific. So I was just thinking, you know, who has the control of the English language? That's so just like, you know, we always, you know, when we want to be very classic, you know, we always refer to that la Academia.
Yeah.
It's very standard, you know, it's the academy
Yeah.
who establishes a standard, the language should be said, that was correct, that was incorrect.
And sometimes those pronouncements from an academy can actually have an influence on the way people speak. That's true, but sometimes it, like the Académie Française says no English words, but people say le weekend, you know, so in some cases it doesn't seem to make a difference. But yeah, that's based on the idea that there should be one correct way. And so who's going to decide? The United States is a little different because we don't even have a regional standard, you know? It's in England it's London, in France it's Paris, in Spain it's Madrid, you know, but in the United States there isn't a regional. I mean, New Yorkers, for example, New York may be the most powerful city, right, the most wealthy city, but it is not our elite dialect by any means.
Help me to understand.
Carol, you were gonna, yeah.
You know, do they, sometimes, do the black people here in the United States speak different than the white people?
It varies, right?
Okay, because, you know, I have the experience when, you know, the person, you know,
Mm-hmm.
having trained in the Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
traditional, white, in the schooling.
Yeah.
And he's a black man.
Yeah.
You know, so he's at the appointment with his customer, the client. And when the client came to ask for him,
Yeah.
he said, "I'm sorry," the person came, he said, "I'm sorry, you know, I spoke with a white person."
Yeah. Well, you can't, yeah, right.
And, you know, people do know the difference.
Yeah. Well, it varies. I mean, in the South, I think there's less difference, but upper middle class blacks are going to sound like upper middle class whites most of the time. Although it's interesting, in Chicago, there's a vowel shift going on in Chicago where people will say the White Sox for this team on the South Side. You'll hear that a little bit in Cleveland too. African Americans don't do that. So it's very interesting that, you know, educated or whatever, they don't participate in that sound shift. So so this is what linguists study. It's like when we see things like that, we say, oh, what does this mean? You know, it may mean, I mean, you'd have to run around and do interviews. It may mean that the African Americans are looking at that and saying, that's a white thing. You know, who knows? It may be the other people are looking at this as, and some studies have shown among whites, it means you're urban, you're not rural. You know, you're not a podunk from some podunk town, you're from the city, you know. So and a friend of mine on this topic is really interesting, John Baugh, is an African-American sociolinguist. He's done a whole thing on linguistic discrimination. He's really good at languages, and so he will get on the phone and sound black and ask about an apartment for rent, right? And it won't be available. He'll use his professor voice and sound probably white, you know, and the apartment will be available, and he's very good at sounding like a Mexican immigrant also. So he's been doing.
What happened to the apartment then?
It's not available either.
There was no apartment complex in existence.
Yeah, right. This was in one study, you know, but this was out on the West Coast.
That was,
Yeah.
That was a commercial on television.
Was it?
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if he consulted for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, yeah, it's very interesting. So he's able to do all these different voices, because he grew up with a lot of Mexican kids, I think. So he's very good, which is why he became a linguist. I think.
That might have been him.
Okay, we did this one. I think I said this already. There's some examples. I tried to think of some examples. So these features in themselves are not good or bad, you know. I mean, this unconjugated B, for example, is really interesting because it's a marker of what's called aspect in linguistics. And we don't have much of that in English, regular English, but West African languages do have aspect. It's very interesting. So what that underconjugated B really means is how something occurs through time. It's continuously here and here and here and here through time. So it has a real function and a semantic meaning. Now, what's really interesting is that the rappers, some rappers don't really know the dialect because they're not, they didn't grow up learning the real dialect, but they know that that B is an emblem of African American vernacular English, and so they're throwing it through their raps everywhere, and linguists are going crazy saying, no, that's not correct. You know, this is not the correct way to use the unconjugated B. But of course, language changes and you can't control it, so maybe it will evolve into something else. But from real speakers that use this form, there's a pattern to it and there's a function to it, you know, which is, interestingly enough, more complicated, more complex than so-called standard English, which doesn't have this. Right? So there's a great example of how dialects can be more complex. I tried to throw in a couple of examples from Chicano English or Spanish influence. If you have students, Chicanos very often will devoice final z sounds into a s sound. Because in Spanish you don't often, I don't know if you ever, I'd have to think about it, or ask Terrell, ever use a final Z. So they will say shoes for shoes. It's very subtle, but people may or may not pick up on that and stigmatize it, but it is an aspect. And these can be speakers. There's a book on Chicano English. Some of the Chicano English speakers don't know Spanish. Okay, so, but this has become a dialect of English. So it has some influence from Spanish. Another thing you might get is the use of on for both in and on. Because Spanish en covers both, you know. So prepositions are really interesting across languages because semantically they cover different things, you know. Okay, this is just a little bit, and Terrell touched on this, so we don't have to stay here very long, but when you really study multilingual speakers worldwide, they mix. Because it's just what people do. And his kids, those were the best, those were such cute examples. And sometimes they become actual mixed languages of themselves, you know, by themselves. So for example, we have in the upper Midwest in the United States going into Canada, something called Michif, which is French and Cree mixed. And it's lasted for some centuries now. But its speakers are in Spanish you'd say mestizos, but they're called metis, you know, people who are half Indian, half French, you know. And they're very different from the Indians in that region. So it's a different identity, a different language, you know, which evolved in history. In Ecuador, there's something called media lengua, which is halfway, but it's a mixture of Quechua and Spanish, which people use to communicate, and linguists have studied it and said it's its own language. It's just evolved from two different sources. So, and then people will do the kind of mixing when they know two languages that Terrell gave you some examples of. And studies have shown that that kind of switching is not really random. If you're very fluent in two languages, that kind of switching can be used very strategically, even though it may be unconscious, to mark a quotation, to address to a particular speaker, to signal something else like solidarity. You could switch into Spanish with somebody that you know also speaks Spanish to show we're in this group. But also we have an attitude because of this ideology of monolingualism that you shouldn't mix languages. I mean, I even found it in my study, the Mexican families. The adults would say, oh no, you shouldn't do this. Although Siduri sat down and listened to all my tapes and says, they're doing it all the time. They say you shouldn't do it, but they're mixing in English words all the time. And even when they're not bilingual, you know, they're saying el basement, and, you know, el sewer, el sewer, yeah, you know, because it's natural. And this is how language changes, you know. English has rolled around the world like a snowball, picking up words from different languages, starting in the time of Shakespeare. There was a vocabulary explosion at that time because they were creating language, words, and they were picking up words through colonialism. What Chicago is famous for in terms of housing is its bungalows. Well, that word's from Hindi. You know? Pajamas is another word from Hindi, which is interesting. Let's see. You can talk about multilingualism at different levels. We have to think about it either at the society level, official languages, local languages. I mean, in India, there's over 200 languages, I guess, and so they have Hindi and English, and then they have all these local varieties. So a lot of people are trilingual, you know. Diglossia is another case where you have two languages like this, a low language and a high language, like in classical Arabic or local vernacular Arabic. It used to be that way in Greece, but now they've all gone to the more vernacular form. At the individual level, we like to call it plurilingualism, and I really like that instead of multilingualism, because what that implies particular things, that it's individuals in interaction, not a society. And in reality, most people who are bilinguals are not equally competent in both languages because they didn't grow up in 50% this context and 50% that context. It used to be we had this idea that if you were bilingual, you had to be like a double monolingual. And the reality is that most people are not. And Terrell's examples of the kids still speaking pretty good Spanish after several generations, but obviously we're more dominant in English. We're more competent in English. And that's just reality. The other thing is, like my poor Chanita, you know, that got knocked about by his Argentinian Spanish teacher for his ranchero Spanish from rural Mexico, and then by his English teacher for having a vernacular English dialect, very Chicagoese, you know. When they switch languages and do their switching, they may be switching from vernacular dialects too. And this has been found among Puerto Ricans in New York too, so that the Spanish they speak wouldn't be considered the standard Spanish of the island, and the English they speak is a local vernacular English from New York City. So when they're switching, they're using vernacular dialects, and the term plurilingualism then allows for that. It sort of recognizes reality, if you will.
I've noticed teaching students that English is their second language. They miss some of the nuances of jokes and things that we speak in English, or when we may be sarcastic. They miss that because it's not their native language, even though they can understand, you know, words. Right. But conceptually, it goes right over the head.
Language is really complicated, and when we learn a language, we learn a lot. We don't just learn the grammar and the pronunciation and the words. We learn all those little things about how to be sarcastic, how to make fun, how to show respect, how to diss somebody, how to, you know, all those things. And kids at certain ages don't know those things. Like one of my favorite examples in English is that at a certain age, children will think it's really funny to say, do you know what time it is? And then you tell them the time and they say, no, I asked you if you knew. You know, because they just figured out that what that means indirectly is give me the time. You know, that's just something you have to, that's part of the linguistic culture around it, you know. There's a lot, and this is why we go to native speakers sometimes, you know, to listen to a tape or to get the nuances.
And does it always involve both speaking and writing?
Which?
Well, when you talk about bilingualism or plurilingualism, does it usually include always writing as well as speaking?
You know, no, and that's a real problem. I think I'm going to have that here. Oops, I better get moving. Yeah, we're gonna come to that. I think I'll skip through this, because I've said some of this. Now people realize, da-da-da-da. Yep, I said that. Okay. Globalization is changing things a bit. You know, we're getting, I guess Lilia Fernandez told you this morning about some of the statistics are kind of surprising about immigration. Immigration is worldwide. And we're sort of moving into a period, I think, where ethnicity equals nation isn't going to work. It hasn't worked for a long time in the United States, but there's this belief in it somehow. Or language equals nation. I sort of hope this anti-immigrant movement is sort of the last gasp in the United States of something that's happened over time. But 1 in 35 people worldwide are on the move, is a migrant. There's a lot more multiple dual citizenship now, multiple identities of people. Here's where you were getting into the question of literacy. When you have Latin American students, you got to be careful. Or Mexican students primarily, although not here, you can have Puerto Rican students. Do they always speak, you have to ask yourself, do they always speak only Spanish? They may not even speak Spanish. The vast majority of Latinos in the United States do not speak Spanish because they've been here long enough that they have switched to English, unfortunately, I think. But some second-plus generations do not know Spanish because of this ideology that we should all speak only English. Some newcomers learn English in Mexico. That's another thing that's going on that Siduri and I have been working on. They use the internet, or they wait till their cousins come from the United States and learn some English. Some may speak an indigenous language. I have a map here of the indigenous languages of Mexico. I don't know if any of you have run into that. Kids labeled Latino who don't speak Spanish because they speak an indigenous language. That would be more likely in Oaxaca, for example, I think. People from Oaxaca in Mexico. Here's a map of the indigenous languages of Mexico, but I'll put this up. It's not, I need to shrink it. Okay, I'll put this on Carmen so you can peruse it. You can see how many there are in the south there, though. Now, here's where we get into the literacy stuff. Most of the time, if the kids do speak Spanish, what they're faced with when they come to school is going from an oral, informal, 5-year-old Spanish. Think of yourself at 5 and what you knew about your native language, you know. And then they're dropped into a situation where they have to learn a second language and to read and write in that second language. I mean, it's a huge jump. And what I think what they really need, and a lot of researchers have said, what they really need is, we need to develop the Spanish, first of all, because they're going to be stuck, they're going to stay at the 5-6-year-old level in Spanish unless they keep using it at home, and it will develop. But it'll be a home Spanish, right, not an academic Spanish. I mean, I've had Latino students. I had a PhD, one of my first PhD students was Latino from Texas, and he tried to take courses in the Spanish department, and he couldn't hack it. He said, I couldn't handle it. And he said, my Spanish is just casero, you know, it's from the house, and it's young, because I was forced. They were punished in Texas, physically punished if they spoke any Spanish, even at recess, at school. Texas has a very horrible history. I hope none of you are from Texas and I've offended you, but, you know, it just gives me chills sometimes when I read about it. And another thing that research has shown that's really important is that you can learn another language if it's oral and informal in 2 to 3 years, so kids will pick up English. It sounds like they speak English, and you think, okay, they're English speakers, but it takes 5 to 7 years to really get the academic level of a language. So you can't assume that they're going to know, like my graduate student just couldn't take a course in the Spanish department, even though that was his first language. So what people would recommend, and all the research shows, but none of the school districts do it for political reasons, literacy first in your native language. That always works better.
Sorry.
Yeah. Do you have a question? No. Yeah. And then you move to the second language. Learn the second language, literacy. And the kids do much better if they learn literacy first, if their language is Spanish, in Spanish. And if we're talking of bilingual education, which doesn't exist very many places in Ohio. I don't think Central Ohio. Cincinnati it does, but it's German-English still. And I think there's some argument for doing it in Cleveland, but the best model for bilingual ed is dual immersion. That's the one that seems to be the most effective. So you have a school where different populations come, you know, English-speaking whites and blacks and Spanish-speaking kids, and they learn each other's languages. And that has been found to be the best model. Nevertheless, even in good schools, one of my colleagues studied one in Chicago, the power of English is absolutely overwhelming. The kids want to use English. Even the Spanish-speaking kids want to use English to joke around with their friends, with their English-speaking friends, with their Spanish-speaking friends. The power of the dominant language is just so strong that the real problem is maintaining a non-English language. And that's been true in the history of U.S. Here's some other languages that have been very big in the history of the U.S. Spanish was here before English, actually, in the Southwest and in Florida. French was here before English in the upper Midwest. German in the Middle Atlantic, the South, the Midwest, and the West. There are more people of German, descendants of German heritage, German origin in the United States than any other ethnicity. And there were 500,000 German speakers on the streets of Chicago, well, not all at the same time, but in 1900, Miami, this is a quote from a guy, I can give you the reference if you're interested. Miami in 1968 pales in comparison with Milwaukee in 1868. There was, and I think Lilia had a percentage about, there was a higher percentage of immigrants in 1910 than there is now in the U.S. population. But in terms of language, we have had a lot of non-English languages. At the time the Declaration of Independence was signed, there were 200,000 German speakers in Pennsylvania, and the Founding Fathers had to discuss whether or not they should make English the official language of the United States. They did not, because they wanted the votes of the German speakers in Pennsylvania. So there has been a long tradition of bilingual education in the United States, especially in the Midwest, and as I mentioned, Cincinnati is an example, but Columbus had bilingual education in the public schools in German in the 1800s. So these are arguments you can use if people say, my grandparents had to learn English, you know, and everybody else has to learn English, and well, sometimes the grandparents didn't, but their children did. You know, the pattern is the first generation that comes either does or doesn't, but picks up some language, some English. The second generation's bilingual. The third generation is often monolingual in English. That's what's happened over and over with languages in the United States. So we've lost a lot of other languages. Indigenous languages were purposefully eradicated. Children were taken away from their parents, Indian children, sent to boarding schools. And as I said, like with Juan, my graduate student, they were punished if they used any of their native language. I mean, it is a trail of tears throughout history. And the anti-immigrant and English-only movements that we're now experiencing have happened throughout the history of the U.S. Germans were lynched. I mean, when I got into the history, I was shocked. I mean, it's deja vu all over again, basically. This is just a cyclical thing that keeps happening. German Americans and I think Italian Americans were harassed in World War I, but German language and teaching was absolutely eradicated by 1918. Just boom. Yeah.
I read somewhere about this exact thing that around World War I, they, in Ohio, like, I forget exactly where, but it was in Ohio, they pulled all the German language books out of the library and burned them in the streets.
They did. They changed Schiller Park to another name, yes, and then it got changed back many years later. But the courts were inundated all over the United States with name change requests. People did not want to have a German name. They changed their names. Parks and street names were changed. German origins were obscured. People just didn't pass them on to the next generation. Some people, some of my colleagues think that this history, which is sort of subconscious in the United States, not talked about, kind of feeds into the furor over English only. That people feel so ripped off from having lost, you know, their heritages, that maybe they just say, you gotta learn English. We did, you know? That this is actually a historical fact that might be feeding in the collective unconscious, if you believe in that. But this is I like to show this, it's small, but to show you the German-American heritage. This is 1990, I think, census. Yeah. So you see, it's heaviest, I think, in terms of where German Americans live. This is percentage of the state. Here we go with Ohio. This, however, is distribution. I can't read it.
German American.
Distribution, that looks like Spanish. Oh well, whatever. It shows that the concentration is in California, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, which is interesting. Since you were in Ohio, I wanted to see that. But again, this heritage has been kind of erased in the collective unconscious. And even in families who don't know that that's their heritage. So once again, we're having anti-immigrant ideologies, and the anxieties get put on, that are about other things, get put on language. And turn into English only when it's really about resources, and it's really about power, and it's really about control, things like that. But it gets put onto the language, and the same thing happens with dialects, right? But it's really interesting because businesses, recently this happened in Georgia, the governor signed you have to show papers law, right, and get rid of all these illegal immigrants. And then the farmers rebelled. Their crops were rotting in the fields because they didn't have any workers to bring food in, right? So the governor quick had to make some changes. And I was thinking, didn't you think that through before you pass a law? I mean, you'd think they'd be a little more rational about it, but it gets so ideological. So very often businesses are pro-immigrant because they're looking for workers. And since the 1920s, when European immigration was cut off, they recruited, I think I mentioned this the other day, Mexicans and whites and blacks from the South to Chicago, among other places. But now we've got globalization going on, and everybody's kind of moving everywhere. There's a lot of multilingualism, and even with global English, well, some people say, why do I need to learn another language? Because English is the dominant world language. Well, there's some predictions that we're not sure what's going to happen by 2050, but the number of Chinese speakers is much larger, and China's becoming a much more powerful economy. And I'm noticing a lot of people trying to learn Mandarin, send their kids to schools where they're going to learn Mandarin. So there's a little power shift going on. And Arab speakers worldwide are a huge number also. So we don't know, you know. Nevertheless, even if you have English, you're fortunate enough to already speak English, you can go a lot of places in the world and use it. It certainly helps to know another language, you know, if only to delay Alzheimer's. So I guess this is probably my last slide, but what I would be arguing for here is to support heritage language maintenance and development so that we can get people who are biliterate. I've had, let me contrast, for example, 2 PhD students I had. One, the first one I told you about, who couldn't take a course in the Spanish department because he had been punished in his elementary school for using any Spanish. He had to drop Spanish, basically. And another one who came to me after being educated somewhat in Mexico, Well, Siduri's a great example of this too. She's not just bilingual, she's biliterate. And that's a whole different thing. So when I have to write, my Spanish is so home Spanish that when I have to write a letter, I have to check with her about the politeness things. You know, because she knows the literate strategies for being polite. And so academic Spanish, academic English, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have all these languages that we've wiped out over the centuries developed so we had a citizenry who could speak all these languages and be literate in all these languages. It would really be an advantage in business and diplomatic relations. We wouldn't have this stereotype of the ugly American going overseas. And equally important, I think, is to tie the promotion of bilingualism and biliteracy with a recognition of the small languages and the vernacular dialects, that those two are legitimate, organized patterns, linguistic systems, and replace the ideology of contempt for the small languages and the dialects with an ideology of respect. That's a big order. And to value multilingualism, or actually plurilingualism, I should say, over monolingualism. I think that's it. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, going back to the harmonics.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, you know, as a support heritage language. You know, we know that we were brought from Africa.
Yeah.
There were so many languages.
Yeah.
That big boat, you know, that was brought all over America. Do you have any research or any feedback, you know, what happened, you know, the relationship with the Algonic?
Yes, I studied that in graduate school. I think it's fascinating. There's a whole field of studies in linguistics called Creole studies. And we have a professor on campus who's an expert in this, Don Winford. And he's from Trinidad, actually. And what happened was, creolization will happen when two or more languages are right here. And what happened in that case, oh, it's different. It depended on the demographics. But the way it was explained to me, that if you were African speaking a bunch of different languages, well, first of all, they gathered the slaves on the west coast of Africa, and they purposely mixed them so they didn't speak the same languages, right? So, because then you can rebel, right? Or you can communicate and devise a plan, right? So, they developed a pidgin English, or at first it wasn't English, it was Dutch, you know, the first colonizers, and then it was another one, then it was English. But the dominant language will provide the vocabulary, and the other languages will provide the grammar. So that's what happens in a pidginization process, and then when there are native speakers of that pidgin, it technically becomes a Creole. And so we have today, even in South Carolina, Gullah, which is considered a Creole language. And it has West African language features. And then some people will argue that unconjugated B is a West African language feature, but gets complicated because it's also used in some dialects of England. So Don Winford said to me recently, no, that's not African, that's actually English. Recent research. So, but it's a really interesting process. And we also have a French Creole in New Orleans, and Cajun, which is different. It's not the Creole. So we have a lot more linguistic diversity than people would imagine in this country. But yeah, that's what happened.
Could we justify that the Ibonics is a matter of, you know, survival, you know, identification with the language that was taken from us?
Yeah, I think what some people think is that African American vernacular English is the result of decreolization, a movement toward the standard over the generations. Yeah. And then you get into all kinds of issues of identity. I mean, we might ask ourselves, why is it when we correct students for 12 years and they go out and graduate, we hope they have some command of academic English, they probably do by then, But they walk out the door of the school and they go right back to their vernacular dialects. Well, there has to be a reason, right? It has to do with identity and appropriateness, fitting in with their friends and their family. You know, I've heard stories of people who were ridiculed because they went back home after a year at college and spoke, you're so uppity now, you're speaking different, you know, so you can't, some of that's identity issues, I think. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.